The winter of 1878 came down hard on Fort Laramie, Wyoming. Wind tore across the plains like an angry ghost, carrying needles of snow that rattled against the wooden buildings of the small frontier town. Horses stomped in frozen mud outside the stables, lanterns flickered along the main street, and the bitter cold forced most folks indoors. Long before nightfall, but one light in town never seemed to go out. It burned late into the night inside a narrow workshop on the edge of the main road. The sign above the door read, Harrison Coal Saddler. Inside, the air smelled of leather, oil, and smoke. And behind a worn wooden bench sat the quietest man in Fort Laramie. Harrison Cole worked with steady hands. His fingers were rough and scarred from years of cutting leather and hammering rivets, but they moved with the careful precision of a craftsman who had mastered his trade. The saddle he was shaping tonight would probably be the finest in the territory, but Harrison didn't care. Not really. He worked because it kept his mind quiet, because silence was better than remembering. 3 years earlier, Harrison Cole had been a different man. Back then, people said he laughed easily. Back then, the workshop had echoed with music, conversation, and the soft humming of his wife, Margaret Cole. She used to sit in the corner chair with a blanket around her shoulders, reading while Harrison worked. Sometimes she would sing, sometimes she would tease him for working too hard, and sometimes she would rest a hand on her growing belly and smile with a quiet kind of happiness, because they had been waiting for their child, a daughter. They had already chosen the name Clara. But the winter of 1875 had been cruel. Fever swept through Fort Laramie that year, moving through cabins and bunkhouses like a silent thief. It took Margaret first, and the baby shortly after. By the time the doctor arrived, it was already over. Harrison buried them both beneath a lone cottonwood tree just outside town. After that day, something inside him simply stopped. The laughter disappeared first, then the conversations. Then the man people used to know. For 3 years, Harrison Cole had lived like a ghost. He worked, he slept, he spoke only when necessary, and he never ever went near the cottonwood tree again. On a particularly cold evening in January, the bell above the saddlery door rang softly. Harrison didn't look up. He just kept stitching leather. "Brother?" a voice said. That voice belonged to Samuel Cole, Harrison's younger brother. Where Harrison was quiet and serious, Samuel was the opposite. He was cheerful, restless, and always talking. Sometimes too much. Samuel stomped snow off his boots and hung his coat by the door. "You're still working," he said. Harrison grunted. Samuel leaned against the counter and watched him. "You know," Samuel continued, "most men would have closed shop an hour ago." Silence. "Town's gathering at the saloon tonight," Samuel added. "Music, poker, Mrs. Patterson, baked pie." "Still nothing." Samuel sighed. "You used to like pie." Harrison finally spoke. "Work." Samuel studied him carefully. 3 years had changed Harrison. The man sitting at that bench looked older than 20-8. There were lines around his eyes now, deep ones, like something heavy had settled permanently behind them. Samuel cleared his throat. "You can't keep doing this forever." Harrison's needle stopped for a moment. "Then," continued Samuel tried again, "you're alive." Harrison, no response. Samuel leaned forward. "And you deserve to live like it." Harrison finally looked up. His voice was quiet. "Living?" Samuel shook his head. Slowly. "No," he said. "You're surviving." That night, Samuel walked home through the snow with a troubled mind. He loved his brother, but watching Harrison slowly disappear was becoming unbearable. Something had to change. Something big. Something drastic. Somewhere between the saloon and his cabin, Samuel made a decision, a wild one, a foolish one, but maybe, just maybe, the only thing that could save Harrison. The winter storm arrived the same morning the stagecoach rolled into Fort Laramie. Snow fell in thick curtains across the town square as the tired horses stopped outside the small boarding house. The driver climbed down and opened the coach door. "Fort Laramie," he called. A small figure stepped out. She nearly slipped. Immediately, the young woman caught herself on the doorframe with a startled gasp. Her boots were thin. Her coat looked too light for Wyoming winter, and a battered suitcase dangled awkwardly from one hand. Her name was Daisy Jennings. She was 20 years old, and she had just traveled nearly 3 weeks from Boston, believing she had accepted a respectable job as a governess for a frontier family. Instead, she had accidentally become something else. Something she did not fully understand yet. A mail-order bride. Daisy blinked at the snow-covered town. "This," she murmured softly, "is not Boston." The stage driver laughed. "No, ma'am," he said. "Not even close." Inside the general store, Sarah Chen noticed Daisy first. The young woman burst through the door in a swirl of snow and nerves. "Good heavens," Daisy exclaimed. "It's freezing." Sarah looked up from the counter with raised eyebrows. "You must be new." Daisy nodded nervously. "I'm looking for." She unfolded a crumpled letter. "Mr. Harrison Cole." The entire store went quiet. 2 cowboys by the stove exchanged looks. Sarah blinked. "Harrison Cole." Daisy nodded again. "Yes, I was told he lives here." Sarah leaned forward carefully. And what business might you have with Mr. Cole? Daisy smiled awkwardly. Well, according to this letter, she hesitated. I believe I'm supposed to marry him. The room fell silent. One of the cowboys nearly choked on his coffee. Across town, Harrison Cole was hammering a saddle buckle into place when the door of his shop burst open. Samuel rushed inside, snow dusting his coat. Harrison, he said. Harrison frowned. What? Samuel looked slightly nervous. Remember how I said you deserved to live again? Harrison stared at him. Yes. Samuel cleared his throat. Well, he rubbed the back of his neck. She just arrived. Harrison's eyes narrowed. Samuel smiled weakly. Your bride. Silence filled the room. Harrison slowly set down his hammer. My what? 10 minutes later, Harrison stormed down the main street with Samuel hurrying behind him. What did you do? Harrison demanded. Samuel raised his hands defensively. I helped. You sent a stranger here to marry me. She seemed nice in the letter. You sent a letter. They turned the corner, toward the general store. Just as the door opened. Daisy Jennings stepped outside. At that exact moment, her foot landed on a patch of solid ice. Time seemed to slow. Her eyes widened. Suitcase flew upward. Her arms windmilled helplessly, and, with a loud splash, he fell directly into the frozen water trough beside the store. Water erupted everywhere. The cowboys burst into laughter. Daisy sat there in shocked silence, soaked and blinking. Then something happened that no one in Fort Laramie had seen in 3 years. Harrison Cole laughed. Not a small chuckle, not a polite smile. A real laugh. Deep, sudden, uncontrollable. The sound stunned everyone around him. Harrison himself looked shocked, like the sound had escaped without permission. Daisy looked up from the trough, dripping wet. Her hair stuck to her face. Her hat floated beside her. She squinted at Harrison. Well, she said firmly. Certainly hope you're the man I traveled 3,000 miles to marry. The town erupted with laughter again. And Harrison, for the first time since the winter he buried his family, was still smiling. For several long seconds after the splash, Fort Laramie went completely silent. Snow drifted lazily through the air, water dripped from the frozen trough, and Daisy Jennings sat waist-deep in icy water, blinking like a stunned duck. The cold finally reached her senses. Oh, she gasped. Oh, she scrambled up, slipping twice as she tried to climb out. The cowboys nearby rushed forward to help, but Daisy waved them away stubbornly. No, I can manage. She tried to stand. Her foot slid again. She crashed into the side of the trough with a loud thump. Someone laughed, then another. And soon the entire street was chuckling. But one laugh stood above the rest. Deep. Uncontrolled. Honest. Harrison Cole? He bent slightly at the waist. One hand braced against his knee as laughter shook through him like something long imprisoned, finally escaping. Samuel stared at him with wide eyes. He hadn't heard that sound in 3 years. Not once. Daisy wrung water from her sleeves and glared up at Harrison. Her cheeks were red from cold, her hair half frozen against her coat. Well, she said sharply, I'm delighted someone is enjoying themselves. Harrison stopped laughing immediately. His expression returned to its usual calm seriousness, though a trace of amusement still lingered in his eyes. You should watch where you step, he said quietly. Daisy crossed her arms. I would have, she replied, if your town had sidewalks instead of frozen death traps. Samuel cleared his throat. Miss Jennings? Daisy turned. Yes. Samuel smiled nervously. I'm Samuel Cole. Her eyes lit with recognition. Oh, you're the one who wrote the letter. Harrison stiffened. Daisy hurried forward, water dripping everywhere. It was terribly kind of you to arrange a position for me, she continued, though I must say the wording was somewhat confusing. Samuel glanced at Harrison. Very confusing. Daisy continued. I assumed I'd be working as a governess. She paused. Instead, everyone seems convinced I'm here to get married. Samuel shifted uncomfortably. Well, he gestured awkwardly toward Harrison. That part is technically true. Daisy blinked. Once. Twice. Then she turned slowly toward Harrison Cole. Her eyes widened. You're Harrison Cole. He nodded once. Yes. Daisy looked at him from head to boots. He was taller than she expected. Broad, shouldered, rugged, quiet in a way that suggested something deeper than shyness. Her expression changed. You don't look like a man who ordered a wife, she said honestly. Harrison replied calmly. I didn't. Daisy turned back to Samuel. You sent the letter without asking him? Samuel tried to smile. Yes. Daisy placed both hands on her hips. Well, that seems extremely irresponsible. The crowd began to disperse as the storm worsened. Sarah Chen stepped outside the general store, holding a wool blanket. Miss Jennings, she said kindly, you're going to freeze. Daisy accepted the blanket gratefully. Thank you. Sarah glanced at Harrison. Well, Mr. Cole. Harrison frowned slightly. What? Sarah gestured toward Daisy. She clearly has nowhere to stay tonight. Samuel jumped in quickly. Harrison has a spare room. Harrison shot him a glare, sharp enough to cut leather. Daisy looked between them nervously. Oh dear, she said softly. I don't wish to impose. The wind howled down the street. Snow thickened. Harrison exhaled slowly. You'll freeze out here, he said. Daisy nodded. Double quotes, yes, that seems likely. He gestured down the street. My house is that way. Daisy hesitated. You're certain? Harrison gave a short nod. It's temporary. Daisy smiled brightly. That's perfectly acceptable. Samuel clapped his hands once. Excellent. Wonderful solution. Harrison walked past him without a word. Samuel whispered after him, You're welcome. Harrison's cabin sat at the edge of town near his sad DLERY. It was simple. 1 floor, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a fireplace that crackled softly when they stepped inside. Daisy paused in the doorway. For a moment she simply stared at the room. Everything inside was neat, precise, ordered. But something about it felt empty, like a place where sound had been missing for years. Harrison hung his coat silently. You can take the spare room. Daisy nodded. Thank you. She set her suitcase down. Water pooled on the floor beneath her coat. Oh dear. She laughed nervously. I appear to be melting. Harrison handed her a towel. You'll need dry clothes. Daisy opened her suitcase. Inside were only a few dresses. All thin, all meant for Boston weather. Harrison noticed immediately. That won't survive Wyoming winter. Daisy smiled sheepishly. I suspected as much. Harrison walked to a small wooden chest. He opened it. After a moment he pulled out a thick wool sweater. It clearly belonged to a man. He held it out. You can use this. Daisy took it carefully. Her voice softened. Thank you. She disappeared into the spare room. The door closed. For the first time in years. Harrison's house was not silent. A few minutes later the bedroom door opened again. Daisy stepped out wearing the oversized sweater. It hung halfway down her thighs. Her wet hair had been loosely tied back. But what caught Harrison's attention was what she carried. A small covered cage. She set it gently on the table. Harrison raised an eyebrow. What's that? Daisy lifted the cloth. Inside sat a bright green parrot. The bird blinked slowly, then shouted loudly, Hello, you miserable cowboy. Harrison stared. Samuel burst out laughing. Daisy covered her face. Oh no, she groaned. Penelope, please behave. The parrot tilted its head. Behave. Samuel wiped tears from his eyes. This is the best day of my life. Harrison rubbed his forehead. You brought a bird. Daisy nodded apologetically. She's my only family. Penelope squawked proudly. Only family. Harrison looked at the bird, then at Daisy, then back at the bird. Your bird insults people. Daisy sighed. She learned most of her vocabulary on the docks in Boston. Samuel laughed again. I like her already. Later that evening Harrison cooked a simple meal. Beans. Bread. Coffee. Daisy insisted on helping. Unfortunately, helping proved difficult. She dropped a spoon, knocked over the salt, nearly burned the bread. At one point she turned too quickly and collided with Harrison, sending both of them stumbling. Samuel watched the chaos with delight. You see, he said, already livelier than usual. Harrison didn't respond, but something strange kept happening. Every time Daisy tripped, fumbled, or muttered to the parrot, he felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close. During dinner, Daisy spoke cautiously. So, she said gently, how long have you lived here? Harrison answered, all my life. Daisy nodded. It's very different from Boston. Yes. Samuel leaned back. You should have seen Harrison before. Harrison shot him a warning look. Samuel ignored it. Used to be the loudest man in town. Daisy looked surprised. Really? Samuel nodded. Always laughing. Harrison's expression darkened slightly. Daisy noticed immediately. The room fell quiet. After a moment she spoke softly. I'm sorry. Harrison looked up. For what? For arriving in your life unexpectedly. He studied her for a moment. Then he said something unexpected. You didn't send the letter? Daisy shook her head. No, that was Samuel. Samuel raised his hand sheepishly. Guilty. Harrison exhaled slowly. Then he said quietly, you can stay until the storm passes. Daisy smiled. That's very kind. Penelope squawked. Kind cowboy. Samuel nearly choked on his coffee. Later that night the house grew quiet again, but not the same quiet as before. Daisy's room creaked occasionally. Penelope muttered strange phrases from her cage. The sound of someone else? Breathing existed within the walls. Harrison lay awake staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't entirely focused on the past. Instead, he found himself remembering Daisy falling into the trough. The shocked look on her face, the way she argued with the parrot, the way she refused help even when soaked in freezing water. And before he realized it, Harrison Cole smiled again, just slightly. But it was real. The next morning, sunlight spilled across the snow. Daisy woke early. She stepped outside cautiously. Fort Laramie looked beautiful beneath the fresh snow. For a moment she simply breathed the cold air. Behind her, the cabin door opened. Harrison stepped out. They stood in silence. Finally, Daisy spoke. I suppose we should discuss what happens next. Harrison nodded. You'll need work. Daisy brightened. I can teach. Mrs. Patterson runs the school. I can sew. Sarah Chen always needs help. Daisy smiled. That sounds promising. She hesitated. In the marriage situation? Harrison looked at the horizon. That was never real. Daisy nodded thoughtfully. Good. Harrison glanced at her. You're relieved. She smiled. Terribly. Then she added playfully. I barely know you. Harrison almost smiled again. Unfortunately, Fort Laramie had already decided something else. By noon, the rumors were everywhere. The saddler finally found a bride. She came all the way from Boston. They're already living together, Mrs. Patterson declared confidently. They'll be married by spring. And somewhere inside the general store, Samuel Cole grinned proudly. Because whether Harrison liked it or not, life had just stepped back into his world, and it had arrived. Wearing oversized sweaters, carrying a sarcastic parrot, and falling into water troughs, winter settled deeper over Fort Laramie during the weeks that followed Daisy Jennings' unexpected arrival. Snow piled along the wooden buildings, horses snorted clouds of steam in the cold air, and the wind sang endlessly across the Wyoming plains. But inside Harrison Cole's cabin, something unfamiliar had begun to grow. Noise. Small, ordinary sounds, footsteps in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, and sometimes laughter. Daisy refused to remain a burden. Within 3 days she had convinced Sarah Chen at the general store to give her part-time work. It did not go smoothly. On her first day she stacked canned goods on the wrong shelves. On the second day she accidentally knocked over a display of flour sacks. The third day was worse. She tried to reach a jar of molasses on the top shelf. The stool wobbled. The jar slipped. Molasses exploded across the counter like sticky brown rain. The customers stared. Daisy stood there, frozen, hands covered in syrup. Then she sighed. Well, she said calmly, at least it smells pleasant. The entire store burst into laughter. Even Sarah Chen couldn't help smiling. For the first time in months, the store felt lively. Word spread quickly across town. The Boston girl is a disaster. People joked, but they said it affectionately because Daisy never gave up. And somehow, despite the chaos she caused, people liked her. Every afternoon Harrison stopped by the store for supplies. At first he only came for business, but soon he found himself lingering longer than necessary. Sometimes Daisy would wave excitedly when he entered. Sometimes she would ask him questions about saddles or horses. And sometimes she would fall over something. One afternoon she tripped on a crate and nearly collided with him again. Harrison caught her by the arms before she hit the floor. For a brief second their faces were inches apart. Daisy laughed nervously. Goodness, she said. I seem to be developing a habit of falling around you. Harrison released her gently. Maybe stop falling. Daisy grinned. I'll add that to my list. Behind them, Sarah Chen whispered to another customer. They're going to fall in love. Fort Laramie was a small place. Nothing remained secret for long. People began noticing subtle changes in Harrison. Cole, he still worked long hours. Still spoke little, but occasionally, very occasionally, someone would see him smile. The blacksmith saw it first. Then, the stable boy. Then Mrs. Patterson at the schoolhouse. Soon the entire town was whispering about it. The saddlers laughing again. Samuel Cole heard the rumors with quiet satisfaction. His ridiculous plan might actually be working. One evening after supper, Daisy sat near the fireplace holding a small notebook. Penelope the parrot perched beside her cage, muttering random phrases. Harrison worked at the table, repairing a saddle. Strapped. The fire crackled softly. After a moment, Daisy spoke. I grew up in Boston, she said. Harrison nodded but kept working. My parents ran a small boarding house. She paused. They passed away when I was 20. Harrison glanced up. I'm sorry. Daisy smiled faintly. Life became difficult after that. She turned a page in her notebook. I tried teaching. I tried sewing. I even worked at the harbor offices. Penelope squawked suddenly. Loud sailors. Daisy sighed. Yes, Penelope remembers those days vividly. Harrison chuckled quietly. Daisy noticed it was a small sound, but real. She leaned back in her chair. I suppose that's why Samuel's letter seemed like an opportunity. What did it say? Harrison asked. That a hard-working rancher in Wyoming needed a wife. Harrison glared toward the other room where Samuel slept. I'm going to kill him. Daisy laughed. Please don't. She looked around the cabin. Honestly, this place is nicer than most places I've lived. Harrison looked surprised. You're serious? Daisy nodded. You have a home. She said it softly. Not everyone does. Not everyone in Fort Laramie appreciated. Daisy Jennings. One man in particular watched her with growing irritation. His name was Earl Braddock. Braddock owned a freight company that ran supply wagons through the territory. He was wealthy, arrogant, and accustomed to people respecting him out of fear. For years, he had quietly controlled many of the town's businesses, including the general store, and he did not like disruptions. One afternoon he walked into Sarah Chen's store and saw Daisy behind the counter. She smiled politely. Good afternoon. Braddock studied her coldly. You're the Boston girl. Yes. He leaned on the counter. I hear you're living with Harrison Cole. Daisy stiffened. Temporarily, Braddock smirked. This town doesn't need trouble. Daisy raised an eyebrow. I'm selling flour, not robbing banks. A few customers snorted with laughter. Braddock's expression hardened. You'd do well to remember your place. Before Daisy could reply, another voice spoke. She's doing her job. Everyone turned. Harrison Cole stood in the doorway. His expression was calm, but something in his eyes had changed. Braddock straightened slowly. Cole. Harrison stepped closer. Miss Jennings works here, he said quietly. Braddock looked amused. You protecting her now? Harrison didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Finally, Braddock shrugged. Suit yourself. He left the store. But the look he gave Daisy before leaving promised something unpleasant. That night, Harrison worked late in the SAD. Samuel stopped by with coffee. You look troubled, Samuel said. Harrison didn't look up. Braddock threatened Daisy. Samuel frowned. That man's been a bully for years. Harrison's hammer struck the workbench harder than necessary. Samuel watched carefully. You care about her? Harrison stopped. No. Samuel smiled knowingly. You do? Harrison stared at the saddle for a long moment. Finally, he said quietly, she shouldn't have to deal with people like him. Samuel leaned back. You're protecting her. Harrison didn't answer, but deep down, he knew Samuel was right. 2 nights later, a powerful storm swept across the plains. The wind screamed against buildings. Snow fell so thick it erased the streets. By evening, the town was nearly buried. Daisy finished closing the store and prepared to walk home. Sarah Chen looked worried. You shouldn't walk alone. I'll be fine, Daisy insisted. She wrapped her scarf tightly and stepped into the storm. Visibility dropped almost immediately. The wind pushed her sideways. Snow blinded her. Within minutes, she lost the path. Panic began rising in her chest. Hello, she called into the darkness. No answer. She stumbled forward. Her boot struck something hidden beneath. The snow she fell hard. Pain shot through her ankle. Daisy gasped. Oh no. The storm swallowed her voice. For a frightening moment she realized something terrible. She had no idea where she was. Back at the cabin, Harrison noticed Daisy hadn't returned. He waited 10 minutes, then 20. Finally, he grabbed his coat. Samuel looked up. Where are you going? Finding Daisy. Samuel glanced outside. That storm will kill a man. Harrison opened the door. I won't be gone long. He stepped into the blizzard. The wind slammed into him immediately. Snow stung his face like needles. But Harrison knew these plains better than anyone. He moved slowly, searching the drifts. Calling her name? Daisy. No answer. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. Then a faint sound. Harrison, he turned. There, half buried in snow near the edge of the street, was Daisy. He rushed forward. Her face was pale. My ankle, she whispered. Harrison lifted her carefully. You shouldn't walk in storms. Daisy tried to laugh. I'm beginning to realize that. He carried her through the wind toward the cabin. Daisy clung to his coat for warmth. The storm roared around them, but inside Harrison's chest, something powerful stirred. Not grief, not loneliness, something else, something warmer, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for years. Hope. Back inside the cabin, Harrison set Daisy near the fireplace. Samuel wrapped blankets around her. Penelope squawked excitedly. Cold, cold. Daisy winced but smiled. I suppose this means I owe you another thank you. Harrison knelt to examine her ankle. It sprained. I suspected as much. Their eyes met briefly. The firelight reflected softly in hers. For a moment neither of them spoke. Then, Daisy whispered something unexpected. You came looking for me. Harrison nodded. Double quotes, yes. She studied him gently. You care about people more than you admit. Harrison didn't reply. But later that night, long after Daisy fell asleep by the fire, Harrison Cole sat quietly beside her chair, watching the flames, and realizing something terrifying. For the first time since Margaret died, he was afraid of losing someone again, because somehow, without meaning to, Daisy Jennings had already become important. By the time the blizzard passed, Fort Laramie looked like a different world. Snow lay piled high along the streets. The rooftops of cabins were buried beneath thick white blankets, and the wind that had howled for 2 days finally fell silent. Inside Harrison Cole's cabin, the fire burned warm and steady. Daisy Jennings sat wrapped in blankets near the hearth, her injured ankle resting on a stool. Penelope the parrot watched her carefully from the cage. Clumsy girl, the bird announced proudly. Daisy sighed. Yes, Penelope. Thank you for the support. Across the room, Harrison worked quietly, repairing a saddle strap, but every few minutes his eyes drifted toward Daisy to make sure she was comfortable. Daisy noticed, and after it, while she smiled softly, checked on me 14 times, she said. Harris glanced up. I have not. You have? Samuel, leaning against the wall with a cup of coffee, grinned. Actually, he said, I counted 17. Harrison shot him a look. Samuel raised his hands. I'm just saying. Daisy laughed, and the sound filled the cabin in a way that felt right. Within a few days, Daisy's ankle improved enough for her to move again. The moment she returned to the general store, the town noticed. But they noticed something else too. Todd Harrison was walking beside her. Not far behind. Not across the street. Beside her, Mrs. Patterson whispered to Sarah Chen. They're practically courting. Sarah smiled knowingly. I give it 2 months. Across the room, Daisy accidentally dropped a jar of pickles. It shattered. Pickle juice splashed across the floor. Daisy froze. Oh dear. Harrison stared at the mess. Then, to everyone's surprise, he laughed. Not loudly. But enough. And when Daisy saw him laughing, she laughed too. The store filled with smiles. Even Sarah shook her head. Best entertainment in town. But not everyone enjoyed the change in Fort Laramie. Earl Braddock watched it all with growing irritation. The Boston girl had become popular. The saddler who once ignored everyone was suddenly smiling again. And worst of all, people were talking about Harrison Cole with admiration. Again, Braddock disliked losing influence. One evening, he cornered Daisy. Outside the store, snow crunched beneath his boots as he stepped. In front of her, "You've caused quite a stir here," he said. Daisy folded her arms. "I'm just working." Braddock smirked. "You're distracting the town? By selling flour?" His voice hardened. "You'd be wise to leave." Daisy met his gaze. "I'm not afraid of you." That was when Harrison's voice came from behind her. "She shouldn't have to." Braddock turned slowly. Harrison stood a few steps away. Steady. But something about his posture made the street suddenly feel tense. Braddock scoffed. "You've changed." Cole Harrison said nothing. Braddock shrugged. "Enjoy it while it lasts." Then he walked away. But Daisy noticed something troubling. Hands were clenched tightly at his sides. That night, Daisy found Harrison alone in the workshop. The lamps cast soft shadows across the leather tools and saddles. He worked slowly, lost in thought. Daisy approached carefully. "You're angry." Harrison didn't look up. "I don't like men who threaten people." Daisy leaned against the workbench. "You've protected me several times. Now?" He stopped working. "That's different." "How?" Harrison stared at the floor for a long moment. Finally he said quietly, "Because last time I loved someone." His voice faded. Daisy understood immediately. "You lost them?" Harrison nodded. "The fever took everything." Silence filled the room. Daisy stepped closer. "Loving someone again won't erase." Harrison looked up. "Sometimes it feels like betrayal." Daisy shook her head gently. "Love isn't something you run out of." She smiled softly. "You just make room for more." The words stayed with Harrison long after she left the room. A week later, Braddock made his move. Late one evening, Daisy closed the general store and stepped outside. The street was quiet. Too quiet. She started walking toward Harrison's cabin. Halfway down the street, two men stepped from the shadows. Braddock's men. "Evening, miss," one of them said. Daisy froze. "I'd prefer you move." The man smirked. "Mr. Braddock says you should consider leaving town." Daisy's heart raced. "I'm not leaving." The second man grabbed her arm. "You might change your mind." Suddenly, a voice cut through the darkness. "Let her go." Both men turned. Harrison stood at the end of the street. He walked forward. Slowly, calm, controlled, but his eyes burned with quiet fury. The man tightened his grip on Daisy. "Or what?" Harrison stopped a few feet away. Then he said something that made both men hesitate. "Already no." For a moment no one moved. Then, the man released Daisy. Two men backed away and disappeared into the darkness. Daisy exhaled shakily. "You came again?" Harrison nodded. They walked back toward the cabin together in silence. Snow fell softly around them. At the door, Daisy stopped. "Harrison?" "Yes." She looked at him carefully. "You keep protecting me." "Yes." "You keep helping me." "Yes." "And you look at me like you're afraid." Harrison frowned slightly. "Afraid?" Daisy nodded. "Afraid of caring." The words hit him harder than he expected. Daisy stepped closer. "Harrison, you don't have to stay alone forever." The wind moved gently through the snowy street. Harrison looked at her. Really looked at her. The woman who had fallen into a water trough. Who dropped everything she touched, argued with a parrot who had somehow filled his silent life with warmth again. Finally he spoke. "I tried not to care." Daisy's breath caught. "But I do." Her eyes widened slightly. Harrison took a slow breath. "I care about you." The words felt strange. Heavy. But freeing. Daisy smiled softly. "Good." Harrison blinked. "That's your response." Daisy laughed. "I was beginning to think you'd never say it." Then she stepped closer and kissed him. For a moment, Harrison froze. 3 years of grief. 3 years of silence. 3 years of believing his life had ended. And suddenly, everything felt alive again. He kissed her back. Spring arrived slowly in Wyoming. Snow melted. The plains turned green again. And one bright morning, the entire town of Fort Laramie gathered outside the small church. Samuel stood proudly near the front. Sarah Chen wiped happy tears from her eyes. Mrs. Patterson whispered, "I knew it." Inside the church, Daisy Jennings stood beside Harrison Cole. The preacher smiled warmly. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" Harrison looked at Daisy. And smiled. "Yes." Penelope the parrot, sitting in her cage nearby, squawked loudly, "Why yes." The church burst into laughter. A decade passed. The saddlery on Main Street became the most successful shop in the region. Inside, Harrison worked beside a small boy who carefully held leather tools. "Steady, Henry," Harrison said. Nearby, a little girl chased Penelope around the room. "Rose, leave the bird alone." From the office, Daisy called out, "Dinner in 10 minutes." Harrison looked around the shop. At his children. At the life he thought he would never have again. Then Daisy stepped into the room. Their youngest child, Thomas, rested on her hip. She smiled at Harrison. "Still glad Samuel sent that letter." Harrison laughed softly. The best mistake he ever made. Penelope squawked loudly from her perch. Miserable cowboy. Daisy laughed. Harrison wrapped an arm around her shoulders, and for the first time in many years, the past no longer felt like a prison because love had not replaced what he lost. It had simply given him the courage to live again.